It began like any other southern evening, humid, heavy, and slow, the kind that made even the cicadas sound tired. Willowbrook Mansion stood quietly on the edge of Charleston, its white columns glowing faintly under the moonlight. Inside, 8 men dined together, men of wealth, influence, and secrets. Crystal glasses clinked, tobacco smoke curled toward the chandeliers, and laughter disguised the tension that simmered beneath polite conversation. At the head of the table sat Judge Blackwood, a man so revered in Charleston society that even his silence carried authority. But that night, there was something off about him. Servants whispered he'd been on edge for weeks, pacing the halls at odd hours, locking his study when no one was watching. Some said he'd been arguing with someone in private. Others swore they'd heard him muttering prayers in Latin, words no one could understand. By 10 o'clock, the guests were preparing to leave. But none of them ever would. At 2 in the morning, a stable boy from a neighboring plantation saw the first orange glow bleeding through the trees. Within minutes, the night exploded into chaos. Flames roared through the windows of Willowbrook, feeding on the silk drapes and mahogany walls. The air turned black and choking. Screams echoed, desperate, human, unmistakable. When neighbors arrived, they found the mansion already collapsing in on itself. The front doors were barred from the outside. Every window on the first floor had been nailed shut. Inside, 8 men were trapped together in the judge's study, their bodies later found huddled near the center of the room. All had died from smoke inhalation. None had made it out. The next morning, the Charleston Mercury ran a brief, almost indifferent paragraph. Fire claims Willowbrook estate. 8 souls perish. That was it. No follow-up. No outrage. Just silence. But rumors spread faster than the fire ever had. Some said it was an accident, a candle left burning. Others whispered about vengeance. And soon, all fingers pointed to one man, Solomon, a 30-year-old house slave recently purchased by Judge Blackwood. Solomon had vanished the same night the mansion burned. 3 days later, he was found at Charleston Harbor, trying to board a northbound vessel. He carried no possessions, only a sealed letter and a ring belonging to Judge Blackwood. He never stood trial. Within 24 hours, he was hanged. Case closed. But the story didn't end there, not even close. You see, witnesses later described something the papers refused to print. When they broke into the ruins, they found signs of 4 separate fires, all started in different rooms at once. And outside the mansion, they saw boot prints in the mud leading away from the site. Expensive boots, the kind only a gentleman would wear. So, who really set the fire? Was it Solomon, seeking vengeance for something we've never been told? Or was the judge himself trying to burn away something he couldn't control? For generations, the answers have been buried, erased by those who wanted the world to move on. But every so often, someone stumbles across a missing letter, a diary, a whisper in an archive that refuses to stay silent. And each time, the story of Willowbrook grows darker. Because this wasn't just a fire. It was a message, scorched into history, warning those who dared to look too closely. Some say if you stand near the ruins today, when the air is still and the trees stop moving, you can hear the faint creak of barred doors and the sound of chains dragging somewhere beneath your feet. Maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe the past is still trying to speak. Before Willowbrook became a graveyard of secrets, it was the jewel of Charleston society, a sprawling estate built on elegance, wealth, and quiet terror. Its owner, Judge Blackwood, embodied everything the Old South celebrated: refinement, intellect, and absolute power. To the public, he was a man of honor, his name cited in legal journals from Boston to Savannah. His court rulings shaped trade laws and property rights. His reputation? Impeccable. But behind the polished manners and carefully trimmed mustache lived a man consumed by obsession, with control, with secrecy, and with something far darker than anyone dared to imagine. Those who worked under him told a different story. Servants whispered that the judge's kindness turned cruel behind closed doors. They spoke of punishments that didn't leave bruises, not always. Sometimes it was silence, isolation, or the simple terror of being noticed. Few slaves lasted more than 2 years at Willowbrook. The ones who disappeared were never spoken of again. To the city's elite, though, Blackwood's word was law. His plantation produced the finest Sea Island cotton in the Carolinas. His connections ran deep. Bankers, lawmakers, and ship captains all found profit in his orbit. Yet, when tax ledgers from that time were examined decades later, historians noticed something curious. His wealth didn't add up. The income from cotton alone couldn't explain the fortunes moving through his accounts. So, where did the extra money come from? A name appears repeatedly in the margins of his business ledgers, the Charleston affair. On the surface, it seemed like a shipping venture. But in whispered circles, it meant something far more illicit. See, after 1808, importing enslaved people into the U.S. became illegal. Yet the demand didn't stop. It simply went underground. Smugglers brought captives from West Africa, landing them along the Carolina coast under the cover of darkness. And Judge Blackwood? He was one of the men making sure those ships disappeared quietly after their human cargo was processed. It's believed that Willowbrook was more than a home. It was a hub, a waypoint for an operation that stretched from Charleston's ports to the plantations of Georgia and Louisiana. And if the records are right, it was also the final stop for many who never reached the markets alive. But what drove a respected judge to risk everything for this trade? Power? Greed? Or something else? Something hidden beneath his own house? In 1821, 2 years before the fire, construction began at Willowbrook. The project was unusual. Workers were brought in from distant counties, paid in cash, and sent away immediately afterward. None of them were locals. They built not up but down. Beneath the wine cellar, they carved out a network of rooms, sealed by heavy oak doors and brick walls so thick that no sound could escape. To the curious eye, it might have looked like a storage vault. But witnesses later described shackles, chains, and drainage channels carved into the stone. Not the kind of thing a respectable judge needed for storing wine. It was a place designed to hold people. That's when Solomon enters the picture, purchased for an outrageous price from Virginia just months before the fire. Unlike most enslaved men, he could read and write. And strangely, that's exactly what Judge Blackwood requested. Why would a man who publicly condemned slave literacy secretly buy one who could read? Perhaps because he needed him for something only a literate man could do. There are letters, now lost, but referenced in later research, suggesting Blackwood had discovered something beneath Willowbrook. Something written in a language he didn't understand. He reportedly hired Solomon to translate, though what exactly Solomon was translating remains a mystery. By late 1822, the judge had grown paranoid. He doubled his security, bought imported locks from Europe, and dismissed 2 overseers without explanation. Then came the mysterious death of a woman named Esther, another enslaved person from Virginia, and possibly Solomon's sister. From that moment, the judge's empire began to crack. He stopped attending church. He stopped hosting gatherings. Until that fateful dinner in January 1823, when he invited 7 men to Willowbrook. Men who shared his secrets. Men who, within hours, would burn alive in his study. Was it a meeting of business partners or co-conspirators? Were they planning to expand their illegal trade or destroy evidence that could ruin them all? Whatever they discussed that night, it was enough to set everything and everyone ablaze. And if the judge's body truly vanished in that fire, as records suggest, maybe it's because he planned for it to. Because when you build your empire on other people's suffering, there always comes a night when the fire finally finds you. When history wants something forgotten, it doesn't erase it all at once. It buries it, page by page, line by line, until the truth suffocates under the weight of official silence. That's exactly what happened in Charleston in the winter of 1823. After the Willowbrook fire, there should have been outrage. 8 wealthy men dead in a single night? That kind of story was supposed to ripple across the South, echoed in every paper from Richmond to New Orleans. But instead, it was barely a whisper. The Charleston Mercury gave it 3 sentences. The investigation lasted less than a week. And by the time the ashes cooled, the case was already declared solved. Solomon did it. That was the line everyone was told to repeat. No trial. No defense. No written confession. Just a statement from the city constable claiming Solomon was apprehended attempting escape with stolen property. Stolen property, meaning Judge Blackwood's ring. The one that, according to one witness, Blackwood was still wearing the night of the fire. Strange, isn't it? Even stranger, the coroner's report filed that same week vanished from county records 2 years later. So did Solomon's execution order. And the sealed letter found in his pocket, recorded as evidence, was logged in an index, then crossed out in red ink. Misplaced, the clerk wrote. But you and I both know what misplaced really means when powerful men are involved. Still, not everyone was willing to let the story die. In 1861, nearly 40 years later, a Confederate lieutenant named Charles Woodbury stumbled upon the ruins while surveying land for military use. His report, rediscovered decades later, described something the official documents never mentioned. Foundation remains solid despite damage. Substructure detected beneath main house, not on original property plans. A secret basement. One the judge's blueprints conveniently forgot. Woodbury recommended a follow-up investigation. None was ever done. His notes were filed, sealed, and almost lost until they surfaced in the National Archives more than a century later. And what's interesting is how his discovery matches other testimonies that were quietly removed from early records. One came from Margaret Carlyle, the wife of one of the victims. She told investigators her husband had mentioned a private meeting at Willowbrook about protecting their interests. He told her Judge Blackwood had found a solution. A solution to what? She never said. Her testimony was struck from the official transcript within a day. And then there's the diary. When researchers in the 1930s reviewed estate archives, they found fragments from the journals of 2 dinner guests. Both men wrote about something called the Charleston affair. Both mentioned vessels lost under unusual circumstances. And both described being summoned to Willowbrook by the judge for a resolution. Those fragments disappeared too. But a pattern was already forming. Every time someone came close to the truth, the paper trail was wiped clean. So, what could possibly be so dangerous about a fire? Maybe the truth wasn't about the fire itself, but what it was meant to destroy. You see, history doesn't just forget by accident. It forgets by design. And those who control the story control the outcome. By turning Solomon into a villain, they closed the case before anyone could ask the real questions. Questions like, why were all 8 men found in the same locked room? Why were the exits sealed from the outside? And why, according to one deputy's private logbook, were there boot prints leaving the scene belonging to a man who should have been dead? In the years that followed, Charleston society moved on. The ruins of Willowbrook were left untouched. No new owner ever settled there for long. And when surveyors returned in the 1860s, they noted an unusual reluctance among locals to even approach the property. As one farmer said in an interview decades later, some places don't forget, even when people do. The story of Solomon was written off as a simple act of slave rebellion. It fit the narrative. It kept the balance of fear intact. But buried beneath that convenient fiction was something that didn't add up, something the records couldn't hide forever. Because, as one historian later put it, you can burn a house, you can hang a man, you can even silence a city, but you can't make the truth stop whispering. And in the ashes of Willowbrook, those whispers were just beginning to grow louder. From a distance, Willowbrook had looked like every other grand plantation of the antebellum South. White columns, sprawling porches, and manicured gardens that whispered wealth and power. But beneath its perfect symmetry was something no blueprint ever recorded, a structure that defied the logic of its time. Even before the fire, workers had spoken in hushed voices about strange additions being built under the mansion. Not cellars or wine vaults, but chambers, long corridors, reinforced doors, walls thicker than any basement needed. When asked what the rooms were for, Judge Thaddeus Blackwood reportedly replied, "For storage." But no one could explain why a storage room needed locks that could hold a man. In 1821, 2 years before the fire, a team of laborers was brought in from Virginia, men who vanished from Charleston records the moment the job was finished. None were locals. None were seen again. According to a surviving ledger, they were paid in full and shipped out immediately. Some historians believe they were silenced to ensure no one ever spoke about what they built. Those underground halls became the estate's most carefully guarded secret. Servants were forbidden to enter them. Even the overseer wasn't given a key. And yet, Blackwood was known to spend hours below ground, sometimes entire nights, carrying oil lamps and pages of notes. What was he doing down there? A single line from one of his surviving letters may hold a clue. Writing to a business associate in 1819, Blackwood mentioned a discovery made upon the lower grounds of ancient workmanship predating any known settlement. He added that it required translation. Translation. That word appears again in later correspondence, and it might explain why, in 1822, the judge paid 10 times the normal price for a literate slave named Solomon. What could a plantation judge need translated beneath his own house? Whatever it was, it frightened him. Servants recalled how the judge, once a picture of composure, began locking every door at night. He stopped sleeping upstairs, preferring a cot near the entrance to the cellar. And then there was the sound, that low, rhythmic pounding that workers reported hearing beneath the floorboards, as if something deep below was shifting, breathing. By early 1823, the judge's paranoia had become legend among the staff. He ordered new iron reinforcements installed around the cellar door. He brought in 6 guard dogs, enormous mastiffs imported from Europe, and chained them near the foundation. And when one of them disappeared without a sound, he fired half the staff. Locals started calling the mansion the house that breathed. When investigators later surveyed the ruins after the fire, they found signs of a substructure, chambers beneath the ash, built from stone unlike any found in the region. The report describing them was filed with county authorities, then sealed within 48 hours. It has never been recovered. But the most unsettling evidence came in 1947 when the state attempted to reclaim the land to build a public park. Workers clearing the overgrowth discovered what looked like a sealed entrance under the remains of the wine cellar, a door embedded in concrete, reinforced with rusted iron. When they tried to open it, they claimed to hear a deep metallic echo from below, followed by what sounded like chains dragging across stone. They abandoned the site the next day. The entrance was filled in, and the project permanently halted. One of those workers, Samuel Johnson, later described seeing markings carved into the wall, strange symbols, nothing like letters, older than English or Latin. He insisted the tunnel leading downward wasn't built by slaves or by anyone from their time. It looked too old, he said, like it had been waiting there long before the mansion ever stood. If that's true, then Judge Blackwood didn't build Willowbrook over those chambers. He built it around them, like a lid sealing something away. So what was he protecting? What did Solomon translate for him in those final months? And why did it drive both men, the master and the enslaved, to the edge of destruction? To this day, no modern excavation has been allowed at the site. Every permit request has been denied, every record redacted. But satellite imaging of the area shows unnatural depressions in the soil, almost like hollow veins stretching beneath where the mansion once stood. If you walk that land now, it feels wrong. Too quiet. Birds avoid it. Compass needles spin there, disoriented, as if something below the surface distorts the pull of the earth itself. Whatever was hidden beneath Willowbrook wasn't meant to be found. And maybe, just maybe, Solomon understood that better than anyone. By the early 1820s, Charleston's harbor was a machine of commerce, sails, chains, and shouts echoing off the water like the heartbeat of the city. The cotton went out. Ships came in. And though the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed for 15 years, the docks still carried whispers of its shadow. Everyone knew the law had changed. But profit always finds a way around morality. The Blackwood family ships were a perfect example, elegant clippers that supposedly carried textiles north and returned with luxury goods. But the cargo manifests never quite matched the profits. And when 3 of those vessels mysteriously sank off the coast of Virginia in 1822, Judge Thaddeus Blackwood filed full insurance claims and was paid handsomely. Except, according to surviving records, those ships were seen docking again under new names only months later. Behind the courtroom respectability, Blackwood and 7 of Charleston's wealthiest men had been financing a smuggling network, bringing enslaved Africans through secret routes, hidden in barrels, beneath decks, or through tunnels that led inland from the marsh. It was called the Charleston Affair. And if the stories are true, Willowbrook was one of its hidden processing points, a place to keep the cargo before dispersal to plantations across the South. And that's where Solomon and Esther entered the story. They arrived from Virginia late in 1822, purchased together at a price so high that even slave traders called it absurd. Solomon was described as literate, of strong mind and sound body. Esther, quiet, of rare beauty. To anyone watching, it might have looked like Judge Blackwood had simply acquired 2 more servants. But there was nothing ordinary about this transaction. According to a shipping ledger uncovered nearly a century later, the sale was marked with a curious note beside Solomon's name. As requested, subject meets all specifications. Responsibility transfers to buyer upon delivery. Specifications. A word used for tools, not people. Blackwood's letters suggest he specifically requested a slave who could read and write, likely to help interpret something he'd uncovered beneath his property. He may have believed Solomon's literacy could unlock its meaning, whatever it was. For a few months, the arrangement seemed to work. Solomon was often seen carrying papers to and from the judge's study, sometimes entering the cellar with him and not emerging until morning. The servants began calling him the chosen one, though not out of envy, out of pity. Then something changed. In December 1822, Esther died suddenly. The official record listed her cause of death as fever, but no physician ever signed the certificate. She was buried within hours, and the body was never examined. Witnesses later told a different story. They said she'd been punished after a disagreement with the judge. They said her screams were heard from the cellar that night, and then silence. To Solomon, that silence must have felt unbearable. Historians believe that was the breaking point. Something in him snapped, grief, rage, or perhaps a terrible realization about what was happening beneath Willowbrook. Because after Esther's death, his behavior changed. He stopped speaking to other servants. He began writing in scraps of paper when he thought no one was watching. A note later found among recovered estate debris bore a chilling line, written in an unfamiliar but steady hand. Some fires cleanse, others seal. Was it his? No one knows. But the timing fits too neatly to ignore. When the fire consumed Willowbrook a few weeks later, Solomon's name became the perfect scapegoat. He had motive, revenge. He had access, as a trusted servant. And more importantly, he had no voice to defend himself. Yet the inconsistencies in his capture tell another story. When he was found at Charleston Harbor, he carried Judge Blackwood's ring, not hidden, but worn, and a sealed letter addressed to no one. Authorities never opened it publicly. It disappeared within days. What if that letter wasn't a confession, but a warning? What if Solomon wasn't running away, but following orders? A theory later proposed by historian Rebecca Sullivan suggested that Solomon may have been working with Blackwood himself, that the judge, fearing exposure or something far more sinister in those underground chambers, used Solomon to destroy the evidence. But if that's true, why was Solomon hanged while the judge's body was never found? Maybe because both of them were meant to vanish. Maybe because they both knew what the rest of the world could never be allowed to see. Whatever the truth, that night turned Willowbrook from a symbol of power into a monument of shame, a place where wealth, secrecy, and human suffering burned together in the same flames. And somewhere in the ashes of that forbidden empire, the story of Esther, the woman who died unseen, still lingers like smoke. Revenge is rarely born in a single moment. It builds, quiet and invisible, like smoke before the flame. For Solomon, That flame had been smoldering for weeks. After Esther's death, Willowbrook fell into a heavy silence. The servants avoided the judge's gaze. The air itself felt colder. Solomon, once trusted to carry messages and records, was reassigned to work in the cellar. Perhaps Judge Blackwood thought keeping him close meant keeping him under control. But in that darkness, something else began to take root, grief hardening into resolve. We'll never know what Solomon truly saw in those underground chambers. But whatever it was, it changed him. According to one surviving account from a neighboring plantation worker, Solomon began speaking in riddles. He'd stand by the riverbank at dusk, whispering to himself, "They must not wake. The fire must eat the truth." At the time, people dismissed it as madness, the grief of a man broken by loss. But in hindsight, those words sound less like madness and more like warning. Inside the mansion, Judge Blackwood was unraveling. He'd stopped holding court. He'd stopped eating at the table. One servant swore she saw him pacing the hallway late at night, carrying a candle and muttering about the watchers below. He ordered new locks for every door. He wrote letters he never sent. And he summoned 7 men to dinner on the night of January 15th, 1823. 7 men who all shared his secret. Historical diaries from 2 of the guests mention the meeting was to discuss containment. That word appears repeatedly, containment. What needed to be contained? The scandal of the illegal trade? The growing suspicion among authorities? Or something far older, buried beneath Willowbrook's foundation? Whatever it was, Solomon understood it differently. He'd lost Esther, he'd lost his freedom, and now he was losing the last piece of himself that still believed justice could come from the men who ruled over him. So he decided to take justice from them. The fire began in 4 separate rooms. That's what the coroner's notes, briefly visible before being erased, revealed. Each ignition point carefully chosen, each door barred from the outside. That kind of precision takes time, planning, and knowledge of the mansion structure. Solomon would have known every hallway, every hidden passage. At 2 a.m., Willowbrook became an inferno. Witnesses miles away saw the orange glow licking at the sky. When rescuers arrived, the flames were too strong. The only thing louder than the fire was the sound of the locked study doors cracking under the heat. All 8 men, Judge Blackwood and his guests, were found together in that room. No one else inside the mansion survived. But what if that was the point? Solomon wasn't trying to escape, not yet. He was making sure none of them did. When he was caught days later at Charleston Harbor, there was no panic in his demeanor. The officer who arrested him described him as calm, as if already resigned. He carried a sealed letter and the judge's gold ring. He didn't beg, didn't explain, didn't run. He simply said, "It's done. It's done." 3 words that sound less like guilt and more like closure. What did that mean? Did he believe he'd avenged Esther? Or completed something greater? Years later, historians would debate whether Solomon's fire was truly an act of revenge or something else, something protective. Theories emerged suggesting he'd learned, through his translations of the ancient markings, that Willowbrook's underground structure was not just a holding place for slaves, but for something that should never have been disturbed. One recovered journal fragment, attributed to an unnamed servant, claims Solomon once said, "There are worse things than chains, and some must never be broken." If that's true, then perhaps the fire wasn't only vengeance, it was containment. To burn out the evil, to bury it in flame, to seal the nightmare before it could reach beyond those walls. Still, for the people of Charleston, the story was simpler. A slave killed his masters, and justice was served. The hanging was done swiftly, with no trial. But the speed of that execution tells us something else. The city wasn't interested in answers. They wanted silence. Yet, silence never lasts forever. Because in the decades that followed, strange discoveries kept surfacing, journals, testimonies, unexplained phenomena around the ruins. And in every retelling, one detail returns again and again. The night Willowbrook burned, witnesses saw 9 shadows, not 8. One of them walked away. In every version of the Willowbrook fire, one fact never quite fits. 8 men entered the study that night, but 9 shadows were seen leaving the blaze. It's the kind of detail historians call superstition, but those who lived closest to Willowbrook called it proof. The first mention of the 9th figure came in a letter written by Catherine Pembroke, whose family owned the neighboring plantation. Dated January 18, 1823, 3 days after the fire, it contained a single, haunting line. They say only 8 perished, but I counted 9 figures moving through the darkness, and the last wore the judge's face, though it was not the judge at all. For over a century, that sentence baffled researchers. Was it a metaphor for guilt? A hallucination born from shock? Or was it something much more literal? Because when investigators searched the ruins, Judge Blackwood's body was never found. Every other man was accounted for, charred and broken, but not him. The explanation offered by the coroner was simple. The fire burned too hot. His remains, they said, must have disintegrated. But fires don't make bodies vanish. And if Blackwood had truly perished, why did witnesses report boot prints leading away from the mansion? Expensive leather boots, the kind only the judge owned. The prints led toward the river, then stopped abruptly at the marsh, as if whoever made them had simply disappeared. The rumors began almost immediately. Some believed Blackwood escaped, using the fire to fake his death. Others whispered of something darker, that what left Willowbrook that night wasn't him at all. Because strange things followed. In 1824, a year after the fire, a dockworker in Savannah claimed to have met a well-spoken gentleman calling himself Thaddeus Black, recently arrived from New York. The man was wealthy, educated, and bore an uncanny resemblance to the late judge. The local paper even noted the coincidence. Then, within weeks, the article vanished from the archives. Census records later confirmed a Thaddeus Black living in New Orleans by 1830. He was listed as a merchant, widower, and former lawyer. His household included a single servant, a free man of color named S. Johnson. A coincidence? Maybe. But those initials S. Johnson would reappear nearly 40 years later in Boston, linked to a man who ran a small printing business specializing in translations. If Solomon truly died at the gallows, how could a man matching his age, description, and handwriting resurface under a new name in the company of the very man he was accused of murdering? Unless, of course, Solomon never died and Blackwood never burned. It's a theory most historians dismiss, but the evidence is difficult to ignore. The execution was conducted in secrecy. Only 2 witnesses, both city constables, were present. No burial record exists, only a note. Body interred without ceremony. What if that body wasn't Solomon at all? What if the hanging was staged, a convenient illusion to close the case and let 2 men vanish into history? But that leads to a deeper question. Why? What could possibly unite a slave and his master, after everything? Perhaps they both knew what was buried beneath Willowbrook. Perhaps they'd seen something no one else could comprehend, something worth burning a mansion for. And then there's the other possibility, that the 9th figure wasn't human. When the ruins were first surveyed, locals spoke of a presence, a shadow moving along the property line, always at night, always in the same direction, away from the house. Generations later, during the 1950s, travelers reported strange lights flickering near the site, followed by the smell of smoke, even though the ground had been cold for over a century. One eyewitness, an elderly man who'd grown up near the property, said he once saw a tall figure dressed in old clothes standing where the mansion's front steps had been. It looked like the judge, he said, but its eyes were wrong. He refused to speak of it again. Whether that 9th figure was a man escaping justice or something wearing a man's face remains one of Willowbrook's most persistent mysteries. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the 9th figure isn't meant to be identified at all because it represents what the fire failed to destroy. The truth. The one thing that keeps walking, decade after decade, refusing to stay buried. And if the stories are true, if the judge and Solomon truly fled together, then perhaps that 9th figure wasn't a ghost. Perhaps it was the only 2 men who knew what really slept beneath Willowbrook, walking side by side into the dark, leaving everyone else to wonder what they'd unleashed, and what they'd sealed away forever. History leaves breadcrumbs for those patient enough to follow them, but the path to Willowbrook's truth is littered with vanished pages, silent scholars, and sealed vaults. The earliest attempt to piece together the mystery came from Dr. Martin Abernathy, a history professor at Clemson University in the 1930s. He wasn't hunting ghosts, just studying antebellum economics, when he stumbled on tax ledgers connected to Judge Blackwood. What he found didn't make sense. The numbers were impossible. Blackwood's declared income was modest, but the movement of money, huge sums wired through shadow accounts and cash holdings, suggested an operation much larger than a plantation's profit margins. And more curious still, every one of the 7 men who died with him at Willowbrook shared the same financial trail. Abernathy began to dig deeper. He discovered letters between the men discussing insurance matters, vessel recoveries, and cargo redistribution. But the tone was conspiratorial, coded, as if the real cargo was something not meant for public eyes. He filed a request to examine the Willowbrook property records. 2 weeks later, his request was denied. 3 days after that, his research office was broken into. His notes, only his notes, were stolen. Abernathy left South Carolina soon after, taking a job in California. When asked years later about Willowbrook, he said, "Some stories aren't forgotten by time. They're guarded by it." The next to pick up the trail was Rebecca Sullivan, a historian in the 1950s who specialized in slave narratives. She came across an old WPA interview from the 1930s with a woman named Adeline Jackson, who claimed her grandmother had worked on a neighboring plantation to Willowbrook. That interview changed everything. According to Jackson's grandmother, Solomon wasn't an ordinary house slave. He was brought in for a purpose. He could read, she'd said, and the judge made him read things that weren't in any Bible I ever saw. Sullivan was fascinated. She followed that thread across archives from Virginia to Charleston until she found a shipping manifest that matched Solomon's arrival. Next to his name, in faint ink, was a chilling note. As requested, subject meets all specifications. That phrase, the same Abernathy had found in financial ledgers decades earlier, appeared again. 2 different sources, 2 different decades, one identical phrase. Sullivan pressed on. She located a survey map of Willowbrook drawn before the fire. It showed not 1, but 2 basement levels, the second one entirely absent from official property records. The lower level connected to a tunnel leading toward the river. That discovery should have made her famous. Instead, it almost ended her career. Within months, her university funding was revoked. She received anonymous letters warning her to stop rewriting South Carolina's history. And one night, her Charleston apartment was ransacked, but only her research notes were taken. When she spoke publicly about Willowbrook, she described the suppression she faced as a wall of silence built higher than any library. But perhaps the most unnerving discovery came not from historians, but from construction workers in 1965. While clearing land near the Every mystery leaves paper scars, the kind written in margins, tucked in folders, or quietly removed from the shelves. The Willowbrook case is no different. In fact, it may be the most edited story in South Carolina's history. The first missing piece was Solomon's letter, the one he carried when arrested. Logged into evidence in 1823, last seen in county records in 1825. 2 years later, the line item was crossed out in red ink. Misplaced. No copy, no transcript, no explanation. The same thing happened to the coroner's report, the execution warrant, and several witness statements. It's as if the county clerk's office was haunted by selective amnesia. Then came the disappearances of those who tried to remember. In 1932, Clemson University historian Dr. Martin Abernathy reopened the Willowbrook file after noticing irregular tax payments made by Judge Blackwood decades earlier. He traced funds to phantom shipping companies and insurance claims that shouldn't have existed. When he requested permission to excavate the ruins, the county denied him. 2 weeks later, his office was broken into. His notes gone. Nothing else stolen. The janitor recalled muddy footprints leading to Abernathy's locked cabinet and an acrid smell of burned paper. 3 weeks after that, Abernathy resigned and left South Carolina for California. He never spoke of Willowbrook again. 30 years later, another researcher picked up the trail. Rebecca Sullivan, a historian specializing in slave narratives, discovered something extraordinary while reviewing WPA transcripts. Among them was an interview with Adeline Jackson, granddaughter of a woman who had served on a neighboring plantation. In her account, Adeline's grandmother claimed Solomon was literate, and that Judge Blackwood had specifically requested a literate slave from Virginia. Sullivan's find directly contradicted every official record of the judge's political stance. She published a paper in 1963 arguing that Solomon might have been framed, or worse, used. Within months, her access to Charleston's private collections was revoked. 2 of her research boxes were reported misfiled and never seen again. But the vanishing didn't stop with paper. In 1965, construction workers clearing ground near the old estate unearthed a small tin box containing a water-stained journal. The entries, written in precise handwriting, were signed only S. The first page was dated 2 weeks before the fire. The last ended the night of January 15th, the night Willowbrook burned. According to the worker, Joseph Miller, the final line read, "Some fires cleanse, others contain. What sleeps below must never awaken." Within 48 hours, county officials seized the box. Miller was fired 2 days later and quietly blacklisted from local work. He left the state and, years later, told his story to a graduate student. The transcript survives, the journal does not. By now, a pattern had formed so clear it almost became predictable. 1. A discovery is made. 2. Authorities intervene. 3. The evidence disappears. In 1968, highway construction near the Willowbrook site uncovered a mass grave, roughly 40 skeletons of African descent, carbon dated to the early 1820s. Many bore grooves on their wrists and ankles, the unmistakable scars of shackles. Their cause of death: dehydration and starvation. Within days, the remains were reinterred in an unmarked lot, and local papers were instructed not to report the find. Years later, a declassified state memo revealed the reason: to avoid public misinterpretation of antebellum property use. In other words, the truth was inconvenient. By the 1970s, Willowbrook had become a ghost even to academia. Mentions of it were scrubbed from historical indexes. Professors who lectured on it found funding mysteriously cut. Even photographs of the ruins vanished from university archives. One librarian confessed, "It's like something doesn't want this story told." And yet, fragments kept slipping through: letters in private collections, survey maps showing tunnels that shouldn't exist, testimonies that spoke of ancient markings carved into stone. The evidence was never enough to solve the mystery, but just enough to prove it was real. Think about that. 2 centuries of deliberate silence. A fire that erased 8 men, and a system that erased everything else. But history has a strange habit: it echoes. And sometimes, the louder you try to bury a secret, the more it rattles the ground above it. Because by the late 20th century, scientists studying the site would stumble upon something even the historians couldn't explain: an energy, a disturbance, a pattern in the earth itself that refused to die. And that discovery would drag Willowbrook back into the light once more. If you visit the site where Willowbrook once stood, you'll find nothing remarkable at first. Just a patch of tangled vines, low trees, and the outline of a foundation half swallowed by soil. The ground looks ordinary, but take a compass there, and the needle spins. Turn on a camera, and it flickers. Locals call it the place that eats signals. In the summer of 1892, a surveyor named William Harrison was the first to notice something strange. His magnetic compass swung erratically whenever he stood near the center of the old estate. Thinking his equipment was faulty, he replaced it, only to watch the new one twitch in the same direction, as though pulled by an invisible current. He filed a short report with the county clerk describing unexplained magnetic interference. That report was quietly transferred to federal custody the following year and vanished from public record. Decades later, in 1962, locals saw black government vehicles arrive without notice. For 2 weeks, men in plain clothes set up tripods, sensors, and sealed crates marked Department of Energy. Then, just as suddenly, they left. When residents asked what they'd been doing, officials said it was an environmental study. But declassified fragments released 30 years later referenced findings consistent with 1892 survey. So what was buried beneath Willowbrook that could attract the attention of both 19th century surveyors and Cold War scientists? One theory points back to Judge Blackwood's letters, the ones hinting that he'd uncovered ancient workmanship under his land. When historians compared his handwriting to the purchase orders of 1821, they noticed something chilling. The blueprints for the underground construction matched not an addition to the house, but a reinforcement around an existing structure. Asterisk, he hadn't been building something new, he'd been containing something old. Asterisk. That idea gained traction in 1953 when a brush fire exposed a stone arch 15 feet below the surface. The opening appeared to lead downward, deeper than any recorded basement. Workers claimed to see carved symbols on the archway, circles intersecting with lines like celestial maps. Before photographs could be taken, the county filled the hole with concrete. A geology student who briefly examined it said the stone didn't belong here. It wasn't native granite or limestone, but some kind of composite that seemed older than colonial settlement. His notes end with one sentence. Whoever built this did not build for comfort. They built for confinement. That line echoes a pattern running through every rediscovery of Willowbrook. Containment. The judge's dinner guests spoke of it. Solomon wrote about it. And those who later investigated the site felt it in their bones. The sense that the mansion wasn't meant to display power, but to keep something sealed beneath it. When the mass grave of 40 shackled bodies was found during highway construction in 1968, state archaeologists were ordered to rebury the remains within 48 hours. The official cause of death: exposure. Yet the archaeologist's private notes, uncovered decades later, record something far more disturbing. He wrote, "Not executed, not diseased, starved in confinement, possibly left to die to eliminate evidence." He added a single question mark under the heading Subterranean Chambers. Even now, the land refuses to rest. In 2003, during a drought, part of the ground collapsed near the old foundation, revealing a stone surface that didn't match the soil around it. County workers filled it in within 2 days. No photographs were released. People who live nearby still talk about the nights when a faint orange glow shimmers over the trees, as if the fire that ended Willowbrook keeps replaying itself underground. They say you can hear it too, a slow, rhythmic echo beneath the earth, like the pulse of a furnace that never went out. Maybe it's just shifting groundwater. Maybe it's something else. Because everything about Willowbrook, the missing records, the sealed tunnels, the government interest, points to a truth too large and too old to fit neatly into history books. Solomon might have known it. Judge Blackwood certainly feared it. And perhaps that's why both men chose flame over revelation. Whatever sleeps beneath those ashes hasn't stirred in 2 centuries. But the ground still hums, and the air above it still tastes faintly of smoke, as if waiting for someone reckless enough to dig again. Every generation rediscovers Willowbrook in its own way, a newspaper clipping, a rumor, a half-remembered name whispered between historians. And every time the truth gets close enough to breathe, someone quietly covers it again. Maybe that's the real story here, not the fire, not the mansion, not even Solomon or Judge Blackwood, but the silence that followed. Silence can be louder than confession. It's the sound of fear turning into policy, of guilt disguised as preservation. And for nearly 200 years, Charleston's polite society has pretended Willowbrook never existed, an elegant omission, carefully maintained. Look at the pattern. Each discovery erased. Each witness dismissed. Each investigator removed. You can almost trace the invisible hand that kept pressing delete over and over across time. But silence doesn't destroy a story. It only drives it underground. And beneath the ashes of Willowbrook, the echo's still live. In 1958, a small note surfaced in the archives of the University of South Carolina, a letter written by a man named Samuel Johnson, dated 1868. It read, "You ask if I regret the actions taken that night in January. I can only say some fires are necessary, not to destroy but to contain. 8 souls were a small price for the safety of countless others. May God forgive what I have done. The signature was blurred, but handwriting experts compared it to the documents believed to be Solomon's. It matched. If the letter was genuine, then Solomon lived, under a new name, carrying the weight of the fire until the day he died. And if he lived, what about Judge Blackwood? A census from 1830 lists a Thaddeus Black, merchant of New Orleans, wealth intact, identity conveniently adjusted. His business partner? A man named S. Johnson. They vanished from record a decade later, possibly relocating to Boston, where in 1856 the Smithsonian received a mysterious parcel from an anonymous sender. Inside was a small stone tablet covered in unknown symbols, accompanied by a note. From beneath Willowbrook Plantation, the only fragment that should ever see the light of day. That tablet disappeared in a fire at the museum archives in 1891. A century later, in 1957, another fire broke out, this time in Boston, at the home of Catherine Blackwood, the last known descendant of the judge. She perished in the blaze. Investigators said it began in her basement, where she'd been researching her family's history. The only surviving item was a half-burned metal box containing scraps of parchment and a fragment of stone identical to the lost Smithsonian artifact. Federal agents confiscated it within hours. Coincidence after coincidence, or the slow, methodical erasure of something never meant to be uncovered? The truth might be simpler or far stranger. Maybe Willowbrook was just a plantation built on cruelty and corruption, a microcosm of everything the Old South tried to hide. Maybe Solomon's fire was vengeance made holy, a reckoning for Esther and for every nameless soul trapped beneath that house. Or maybe it was something more, a containment, as his letter suggested. Maybe he wasn't just burning the guilty. Maybe he was sealing something the judge had unearthed, something that shouldn't have survived the light. And that's the enduring power of Willowbrook. You can read every account, study every clue, and still walk away with more questions than answers. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what someone decided you should know. Stand at the edge of the ruins today, and it's almost peaceful. The air smells of pine. The crickets hum. Yet if you stay long enough, the wind begins to shift, and for a moment you could swear you hear a faint crackle, like wood catching flame. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's warning. 2 centuries ago, a man named Solomon lit a fire to erase a nightmare. 2 centuries later, we're still trying to understand what burned that night and what survived it. Some stories end in answers. Willowbrook ends in silence. And maybe that's the truest kind of ending history can offer. Not closure, but caution. Because as every whisper from that cursed ground seems to remind us, not everything buried stays dead.